I never imagined my husband's funeral would be the day my entire life unraveled. Standing beside Richard's mahogany coffin, surrounded by 200 mourners dressed in black, I thought I'd reached the deepest point of grief a person could feel. I was wrong. The worst was still coming, and it would arrive in the form of a stranger's tears and a blood-red rose. She appeared near the back of St. Catherine's Church, a young woman I'd never seen before, maybe 30 years old with dark hair cascading past her shoulders and eyes swollen from crying. I noticed her because her sobs echoed through the sanctuary, raw and desperate, louder than anyone else's grief, louder than mine. My daughter Patricia whispered, "Who is that?" But I couldn't answer. I didn't know her. I'd never seen her face in 42 years of marriage. During the graveside service, as people laid flowers on Richard's coffin, she approached. Her hands trembled as she placed a single perfect red rose on the polished wood. But as she turned to leave, our eyes met. Her expression wasn't just sorrowful, it was urgent, terrified. And beneath that rose, I noticed a small white envelope tucked against the stem. After the crowds dispersed and I stood alone at the grave, I retrieved that envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. 8 words that stopped my heart. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry for your loss, but you're in danger." The note continued. "Your husband wasn't who you thought he was. Check the storage unit on Maple Street, Unit 247. The code is 1983. Trust no one in your family. They know. Please be careful. A friend." I stood there in the cemetery, holding that note, and felt my entire world tilt sideways. She wasn't mourning my husband. She was warning me. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Now let me tell you who I was before that funeral shattered everything I believed about my life. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 67 years old, and until 3 days ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. A devoted wife, a loving mother, a doting grandmother. The kind of woman who bakes chocolate chip cookies for the neighborhood kids and never misses Sunday service at church. I'd been married to Richard for 42 years. We bought our brick house in suburban Cleveland in 1983 with money we'd saved for 5 years. I planted the rose garden out front myself, on my hands and knees, while 7 months pregnant with our youngest daughter, Susan. I raised 3 children mostly alone because Richard traveled constantly for his consulting business, sometimes 2 weeks every month. I never complained. That's what good wives did, wasn't it? They sacrificed. They held the family together. They made everything work. I wore my silver hair in a neat bun, owned 2 nice dresses, one of which I wore to Richard's funeral, and lived a simple, quiet life centered around family. My children called me old-fashioned. My grandchildren said I made the best apple pie in Ohio. Everyone at church called me a saint because I'd nursed Richard through his final illness without a single complaint, sitting beside his bed every single night, holding his hand as cancer slowly stole him away. I was the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect victim, and I had absolutely no idea what was coming for me. For 42 years, my life followed a rhythm as predictable and comforting as a heartbeat. Every morning began the same way. My alarm clock buzzing at 6 a.m., the sound of birds chirping outside our bedroom window, and me padding downstairs in my slippers to start Richard's coffee. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, always in his favorite blue mug that our daughter Patricia had made in elementary school art class. The handle was chipped, but he refused to use any other cup. By 6:30, I'd have his breakfast ready: scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, and orange juice. Richard would come down in his crisp business suit, kiss my cheek absent-mindedly, scan the morning paper, and tell me about his day ahead. Meetings in Columbus, a client presentation in Cincinnati, a conference in Pittsburgh. His consulting firm kept him busy, important, always traveling. I understood. A man had to provide for his family, didn't he? Our home was filled with evidence of our life together. Framed photos lined the hallway. Our wedding day in 1983, me in my simple white dress and Richard looking so handsome in his rented tuxedo. Baby pictures of Daniel, Patricia, and Susan. School graduations, family vacations to Lake Erie, where the kids built sandcastles, while Richard worked on his laptop under an umbrella. Christmases and birthdays, and ordinary Tuesdays that somehow became precious when frozen in time. I spent my days maintaining the world Richard had built for us. Mondays were for laundry and grocery shopping. Tuesdays I volunteered at St. Catherine's Church, organizing donation drives and helping Father Michael with the parish newsletter. Wednesdays I tended my rose garden, pruning, watering, talking to the flowers like they were old friends. Thursdays were for baking. Fridays I cleaned the house top to bottom, even though it was just the two of us now and the place barely got dirty anymore. When Richard traveled, which was often, he called me every single night at 9 p.m. sharp. I'd curl up in our worn armchair with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to him complain about terrible hotel coffee and boring dinner meetings. "I miss your cooking, Maggie," he'd say, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "These restaurant steaks have nothing on your pot roast." Those phone calls made the empty house feel less lonely. I'd tell him about my day, Mrs. Henderson's hip surgery, the new rose bush I'd planted, how our granddaughter Emma had called asking for my cookie recipe. Small, ordinary things. Richard would listen, make appropriate sounds of interest, and tell me he loved me before hanging up. It was routine, comfortable, safe. On weekends when Richard was home, we had our traditions. Saturday mornings meant farmers' market trips together, his hand warm in mine as we picked out fresh vegetables. Sunday afternoons we'd watch Jeopardy, competing to see who could answer more questions correctly. I usually won, which made Richard laugh and call me his secret genius. Sunday evenings the whole family gathered for dinner. Daniel and his wife, Patricia and her husband, Susan and her 2 kids. I'd cook enough food to feed an army, and Richard would sit at the head of the table, beaming like a king surveying his kingdom. I thought I knew every detail of Richard's life, every habit, every preference, every dream. I thought 42 years meant something. I thought we'd built something real together, something honest and true. I was so incredibly, devastatingly wrong. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before Richard died. I was in our bedroom, organizing his medications into the weekly pill organizer the hospice nurse had provided. Richard was sleeping fitfully in the hospital bed we'd set up near the window, his breathing shallow and labored. Cancer had turned my strong, confident husband into a frail shadow, his skin gray and paper-thin, his body shrinking beneath the blankets. I opened his nightstand drawer to put away his reading glasses, and that's when I saw it, a phone I didn't recognize. It was tucked beneath old tax documents and a stack of business cards, deliberately hidden where someone wouldn't find it unless they were looking. Not Richard's iPhone that Patricia had taught him to use, not the landline we'd had for decades. This was a cheap flip phone, the kind drug dealers used in television shows, the kind people stopped carrying years ago. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was lightweight, plastic, unremarkable. I tried to turn it on, but the battery was dead. Why would Richard have a second phone? Why would he hide it in his nightstand drawer beneath papers that hadn't been touched in months? The questions buzzed in my mind like angry wasps, making my chest feel tight. I stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes, staring at this small black rectangle that suddenly felt heavy as a brick. Around me, our bedroom looked exactly as it always had. The floral wallpaper I'd chosen in 1985, the wedding photo on Richard's dresser, the cross-stitched Bible verse I'd made hanging above the bed. Everything familiar, everything safe, except for this phone that didn't belong. "Maggie?" Richard's voice was weak, pulling me from my thoughts. "What are you doing?" I turned, clutching the phone. His eyes were open now, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was that alarm I saw flash across his face? Or was I imagining things, letting grief and exhaustion play tricks on my mind? Richard, I found this phone in your drawer. I held it up, keeping my voice gentle. He was dying. I couldn't interrogate a dying man. I didn't know you had two phones. For just a second, maybe less, something changed in his face. His jaw tightened, his eyes sharpened despite the morphine fog. Then it was gone, replaced by the confused, weak expression of a man at death's door. Oh, that old thing. He tried to wave his hand dismissively, but he was too weak. The gesture barely happened. That's from my business, honey. Haven't used it in years. Probably doesn't even work anymore. I don't even know why I kept it. His explanation was reasonable. Of course it was from his business. Richard had been a consultant for 40 years, always carrying multiple devices, always connected to clients and partners. I smiled, feeling foolish for the spike of anxiety that had shot through me. Should I throw it away then? No, just put it back. You know how I am about keeping old things. He managed a weak smile. Sentimental old fool. I kissed his forehead, feeling the fever heat radiating from his skin, and placed the phone back exactly where I'd found it. But as I returned to sorting his medications, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Something felt wrong. Something felt off, like a picture frame hanging slightly crooked. Barely noticeable, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself grief was making me paranoid. I told myself Richard would never lie to me. I was wrong about all of it. I didn't think about the phone again that day. Or rather, I forced myself not to think about it. Richard's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I had more important things to worry about than an old piece of outdated technology gathering dust in a drawer. Every hour brought new challenges, adjusting his pain medication, helping him sip water through a straw, changing his sheets when he was too weak to move himself. This was what mattered. This was where my focus belonged. That night, lying in the guest room bed, because the hospital equipment had taken over our bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and felt that phone pulling at my thoughts like a loose thread on a sweater. Stop it, Margaret, I scolded myself. The man is dying. Your husband of 42 years is dying and you're obsessing over a forgotten phone from his business days. What kind of wife are you? The guilt was crushing. Here I was, doubting Richard when he was at his most vulnerable, when he could barely speak without gasping for air, when his body was shutting down piece by piece. I felt ashamed, small, paranoid. Grief did strange things to people's minds. I knew that. Maybe this was my brain's way of protecting itself from the unbearable reality that soon I'd be alone. The next morning, I threw myself into caregiving with renewed devotion. I read to Richard from his favorite Tom Clancy novels, even though I wasn't sure he could hear me anymore. I played the jazz music he loved, Miles Davis and John Coltrane, on the old CD player. I held his hand and told him stories about our life together, reminding him of the good times, the happy memories, the 42 years we'd built together. When the hospice nurse came for her daily visit, she commented on how devoted I was, how lucky Richard was to have such a loving wife by his side. On Thursday morning, just after dawn, Richard stopped breathing. I was sitting in the chair beside his bed, half asleep, when I noticed the silence. The labored breathing that had filled our bedroom for weeks had simply stopped. I reached for his hand, still warm, and pressed my fingers to his wrist. No pulse. He was gone. I should have cried. I should have collapsed. Instead, I felt strangely numb, like my body had gone into autopilot mode. I called the hospice nurse first, then my children. Within 2 hours, our house was filled with people. Daniel and Patricia taking charge, making phone calls, coordinating with the funeral home. Susan held my hand and cried. I comforted her, stroked her hair, told her everything would be okay. Everyone kept telling me how strong I was, how brave, how graceful in my grief. I smiled and nodded and accepted casseroles from neighbors and let my children make all the decisions about the funeral arrangements. I was the perfect grieving widow, dignified, composed, selfless, even in my sorrow. I picked out Richard's navy suit, the one he wore to Susan's wedding. I wrote his obituary myself, listing all his accomplishments, his wonderful family, his 42 years married to his devoted wife, Margaret. But late at night, alone in the guest room bed, I kept seeing that phone in my mind. That small black flip phone hidden beneath papers in Richard's nightstand. And a tiny voice in the back of my mind, a voice I desperately tried to silence, kept whispering, "Why? Why did he hide it? Why did his face change when you found it? Why?" I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself grief made people think crazy things. I told myself Richard had been a good, faithful, honest man. I told myself lies. The funeral was held on a gray Tuesday morning at St. Catherine's Church, the same sanctuary where Richard and I had exchanged vows 42 years earlier. I remembered standing at that altar in my simple white dress, looking into Richard's eyes and believing we'd be together forever. Now I was back, staring at his closed coffin covered in white lilies, trying to comprehend that forever had ended. Over 200 people filled the pews. Richard had been well known in Cleveland's business community, respected, successful, admired. Colleagues in expensive suits, clients he'd worked with for decades, neighbors from our street, members of our church congregation. They filed past me in the front pew, squeezing my hand, murmuring condolences that blurred together into meaningless noise. He was a good man. Such a loss. Our thoughts are with you. I nodded mechanically, accepting their words, playing my role. Daniel sat on my right, stiff and formal in his black suit. Patricia sat on my left, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Susan held my hand, her grip tight and trembling. My children were grieving their father. I should have been comforting them. Instead, I felt like I was watching the funeral through a fog, disconnected from my own body. That's when I noticed her. She stood near the back of the church, partially hidden behind a stone column. A young woman, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair falling past her shoulders and a black dress that looked expensive. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention. It was her crying. Deep, gasping sobs that echoed through the sanctuary. Her whole body shook with grief. Her face was buried in her hands, and even from the front pew I could hear her anguish. I leaned toward Patricia and whispered, "Who is that woman? The one in the back, crying?" Patricia glanced over her shoulder, then shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe someone from Dad's work? He knew a lot of people." But something about the woman's grief felt different. It wasn't the polite, respectful sorrow of a colleague. It was raw, personal, intimate. She was crying harder than anyone else in that church, harder than our children, harder than me. At the graveside service, the sky threatened rain. People gathered around the open grave, and the priest said final prayers while I stood there clutching a single white rose, the traditional flower for the widow to lay on the coffin. As others began placing their flowers, carnations, daisies, more lilies, I saw her again. The young woman approached the coffin with unsteady steps, her face blotchy and swollen from crying. She placed a single red rose on the polished mahogany. Her hand lingered on the coffin for a moment, and I saw her lips move, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then, as she turned to walk away, our eyes met. That look. I'll never forget that look. It wasn't just grief in her eyes. It was fear, desperation, urgency. She held my gaze for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and in that moment something passed between us. A warning, a plea. Then she disappeared into the crowd of mourners. I looked back at the coffin and noticed something I'd missed before. Tucked beneath the stem of her red rose was a small white envelope. My heart began to pound. Around me, people were dispersing, heading to their cars, murmuring about the reception at our house. But I couldn't move. I stood frozen, staring at that envelope. When the last person left and I was finally alone at the graveside, I reached out with shaking hands and picked up that envelope. Inside was a handwritten note that would change everything. I didn't tell anyone about the note. Something in that young woman's terrified eyes told me to keep it secret. That night, while my children sat in my living room sorting through Richard's papers and discussing funeral expenses, I excused myself. "I'm exhausted," I told them, which wasn't a lie. "I think I need to lie down." But I didn't lie down. I grabbed my car keys, slipped out the back door, and drove my old Honda Civic toward Maple Street, with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The note was folded in my coat pocket, burning like a hot coal against my chest. Unit 247, Code 1983. Trust no one in your family. They know. What did they know? What was I about to find? Maple Street Storage sat behind an abandoned strip mall on the east side of Cleveland, a place I'd driven past 1,000 times without ever really seeing. The facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence, the kind of place that felt anonymous and forgotten, perfect for hiding secrets. I parked under a broken streetlight and walked toward the rows of orange metal doors, my breath coming in short gasps. Unit 247 was in the back corner. I stood in front of the keypad, my finger hovering over the numbers. 1983, the year we bought our house, the year we planted the rose garden together, the year I thought our real life was beginning. I punched in the code. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt impossibly loud in the silence. Inside, the unit was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, filled with cardboard file boxes stacked neatly against the walls. A folding table held a laptop computer covered in dust. Everything was organized, methodical, exactly like Richard always kept his business files. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe this was just old business records. Maybe the note was a mistake. Then I opened the first box, bank statements, dozens of them, accounts I'd never heard of in banks I didn't recognize. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving in and out. Transfers, deposits, withdrawals, and the names on the accounts. One was Richard's, but another name appeared over and over, Robert Collins. I stared at that name, confused, until I found a driver's license paper clip to one of the statements. Richard's photo, Robert Collins's name. My husband had been living under a fake identity. My hands shook as I reached for the second box. Inside were rental agreements for an apartment in Columbus, 2 hours away, utility bills for an address I'd never seen, restaurant receipts for 2 people, hotel reservations, plane tickets to places Richard had told me were business trips but were clearly vacations. And then I found them. Photographs. Richard with the young woman from the funeral. Richard with his arm around her waist at a beach, somewhere tropical. Richard kissing her on a park bench. Richard and her at a restaurant, holding hands across the table, looking at each other the way he used to look at me 40 years ago. Some photos were recent. I could tell by Richard's gray hair, but others were older, much older. I flipped one over. A date was written on the back in Richard's handwriting. Jenny and me, anniversary trip, 2010. 15 years. This had been going on for 15 years. I couldn't breathe. The storage unit felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing against my chest. But I kept digging because I had to know. I had to know everything. That's when I found the estate documents and the letter that destroyed me completely. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that storage unit for 3 hours, reading every document with growing horror. The affair was devastating enough. 15 years of lies, 15 years of Richard living a double life with a woman named Jennifer Hartwell. But what I discovered next was so much worse. This wasn't just about love or betrayal. This was about money. This was about theft, and my own children were part of it. The file labeled Estate Plan Revised contained documents that made my blood turn to ice. Page after page of legal paperwork, all dated within the last 2 years, systematically transferring everything Richard and I owned out of my name. Our house, the house I'd lived in for 40 years, the house where I'd raised our children, was being moved into a liquidation trust. Richard's life insurance policy, the one I thought would help me survive after he was gone, had been changed. The beneficiary was no longer me. It was Jennifer Hartwell. $2 million going to his mistress. His business assets, his retirement accounts, his investment portfolios, everything was being funneled into trusts and accounts that excluded me entirely. According to these documents, I would be left with almost nothing. Maybe enough to rent a small apartment somewhere. Maybe enough to survive on Social Security. After 42 years of marriage, after raising his children, after sacrificing my education and career to be his wife, I was being erased. But the documents themselves weren't the worst part. The worst part was the signatures. Each revised estate document had been notarized and witnessed. I recognized the notary stamp immediately. It belonged to my son Daniel's law firm. Daniel had notarized his father's signature on documents that would rob his own mother. He'd known. My lawyer's son, who I'd put through law school by working 2 jobs when Richard's business was struggling, had helped his father steal from me. Then I found the emails. Richard had printed them out and filed them carefully, like evidence he was preserving. Emails between him and his business partner, Michael Preston, the man who'd been Richard's best man at our wedding, who I'd invited to Sunday dinners for 20 years. The emails discussed estate restructuring and minimizing Margaret's legal claims and ensuring a clean transfer of assets upon death. There were emails from Patricia, my oldest daughter. "Dad, I talked to Mom about downsizing. She's resistant, but I think after you're gone, Daniel and I can convince her to sign over power of attorney. Once we have that, we can sell the house quickly and distribute everything according to your plan. She won't understand the paperwork. She never has." My daughter was calling me stupid. My daughter was planning to manipulate me after her father's death. I found a projected timeline. Richard's death was estimated for late October. The house sale was scheduled for November. Asset distribution was planned for December. They had choreographed my financial destruction like a ballet. Every step planned, every movement calculated. By Christmas, I would have been homeless, penniless, and completely at my children's mercy. But there was one more file, one more set of documents that made me realize this conspiracy was even darker than theft. It was a receipt from a pharmacy, dated 3 months before Richard's death. Medications I didn't recognize. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and searched the names. Heart medications. The kind that would interact dangerously with Richard's cancer treatments. The kind that could accelerate death. They hadn't just stolen from him. They might have killed him. I don't remember driving home from the storage unit. I don't remember parking my car or walking through my back door. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my dark kitchen at 2 in the morning, surrounded by 42 years of memories. And I was breaking apart. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside me, somewhere I didn't know existed. They tore through my chest like physical pain, making it impossible to breathe. I pressed my hands over my mouth to muffle the sound because my children were asleep upstairs. My children who had betrayed me, who had plotted against me, who had smiled to my face while planning my destruction. I looked around the kitchen I'd stood in nearly every day for 4 decades. The scratches on the counter from where Daniel had dragged his toy trucks as a toddler. The height marks on the doorframe where I'd measured all 3 children as they grew. The window over the sink where I'd stood washing dishes 10,000 times, looking out at the rose garden, believing I was building something permanent and real. It had all been a lie. My wedding photo hung on the wall. Me at 25, radiant in white, gazing at Richard with absolute trust and adoration. I'd loved him so completely. I'd believed in him with every fiber of my being. When he'd said his vows, I'd thought they meant something, in sickness and in health. For richer or poorer, till death do us part. Every word had been a performance. Every promise had been empty. Memories flooded over me like drowning waves. Richard in the hospital with pneumonia in 1995 and me sitting by his bedside for 3 days straight, feeding him ice chips, reading to him, praying for his recovery. Had he been thinking about Jennifer even then? Had he wished it was her hand holding his instead of mine? I remembered working 2 jobs when his business nearly failed in the early years. I'd waitressed at night while he rebuilt his client base. Was that when he'd met her? While I was exhausted and struggling to keep our family afloat, had he been starting his double life? I'd turned down a full scholarship to nursing school when we got married because Richard wanted me home with the children. "We can't both have careers, Maggie," he'd said. "A family needs a mother, not two professionals." So I'd given up my dreams. I'd filed away my acceptance letter and become what he needed me to be. I'd sacrificed everything, my education, my career, my independence, my identity, to be his wife and mother to his children. And this was how he repaid me. By stealing everything and giving it to his mistress, by training our children to view me as an obstacle to dispose of. I walked to my rose garden in the darkness, still wearing my funeral dress, and collapsed onto the ground between the bushes I'd planted with such hope. The dirt pressed against my knees, the thorns caught at my sleeves. I sobbed into my hands until my throat was raw, until I had no tears left, until the sky began to lighten, with dawn. For 67 years, I'd tried to be good, kind, selfless, devoted, and it had earned me nothing but betrayal. I'd been a fool, a naive, trusting fool who'd let everyone use her. But as the sun rose over my garden, something shifted inside me. The grief began to crystallize into something harder, something colder, something dangerous. I was done being the victim. It was time to fight back. I stood up from my garden as the sun broke over the horizon, brushed the dirt off my knees, and walked back into my house with my spine straight and my jaw set. Something fundamental had changed in those dark hours on the ground. The helpless, grieving widow had died in that garden. Someone new had taken her place. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, a 67-year-old woman with tangled gray hair, dirt-smudged cheeks, and red-rimmed eyes. But those eyes were different now. They were sharp, focused, angry. For 42 years, everyone had underestimated me. Just a housewife. Sweet Margaret. She doesn't understand these complicated financial matters. They'd patted me on the head and dismissed me as simple and naive. That had been their first mistake. I made myself a strong cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the weak tea I'd been drinking since Richard got sick, and sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote 2 words. They know. Underneath, I listed every person who had betrayed me. Richard, Jennifer Hartwell, Daniel, Patricia, Michael Preston. Next to each name, I wrote what they'd done and what evidence I had. Then I started a second list, what I need. Evidence, legal help, allies I could trust, a plan that would expose them all and protect me from retaliation. I'd spent 40 years managing a household, coordinating schedules for 3 children, organizing church fundraisers and family reunions. I knew how to plan. I knew how to pay attention to details, and I'd been married to a business consultant for 4 decades. I'd absorbed more about strategy, documents, and negotiations than anyone realized. The question was, who could I trust? Daniel and Patricia were obviously out. Michael Preston, too. Richard's other business associates might be involved, or they might report back to my children. Most of my friends were really our friends, couples we socialized with who would side with Richard's memory. But Susan, my youngest daughter, hadn't appeared in any of those emails. There'd been no mentions of her in the conspiracy documents. Either she wasn't involved, or she was very good at hiding it. I called Susan that afternoon and asked her to meet me for lunch, somewhere far from our neighborhood, away from anyone who might know us. She arrived at the diner looking concerned, giving me a tight hug. "Mom, are you okay? You look exhausted." I ordered coffee and waited until the waitress left. Then I looked my daughter in the eyes and asked carefully crafted questions, watching her. Reactions like a scientist studying an experiment. "Susan, did your father ever talk to you about updating his will?" Her confusion seemed genuine. "Did Daniel or Patricia mention anything about me moving into assisted living?" Her shock appeared real. Finally, I made my decision. I slid a folder across the table, copies of some of the documents I'd found. "I need you to read these." And then I need you to tell me the truth about what you know." Susan's hands trembled as she read. Her face went white, then red with fury. Patricia and Daniel knew? They knew Dad was doing this? "Mom, this is fraud. This is theft. This is war," I said quietly, my voice steady and cold. "And I intend to win. But I need to know right now, are you with me or are you with them?" Susan reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "I'm with you, Mom, always." I smiled, not a sweet grandmotherly smile, a warrior's smile. "Good. Then here's what we're going to do." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret Hayes became someone she'd never been before. A strategist, a spy, a woman with a mission. But she did it all while wearing the mask of the grieving widow, shuffling around her house in her bathrobe, accepting casseroles from neighbors, and playing confused whenever Daniel or Patricia visited with more papers to sign. Her first move was finding the right lawyer. Not someone from Daniel's network, not anyone in Cleveland's legal circles who might have connections to her family. Susan found Rebecca Torres through an online search, a sharp attorney from Akron who specialized in elder abuse and estate fraud. Margaret met her in a coffee shop an hour outside the city, bringing 3 boxes of copied documents. Rebecca spread the papers across the table, her eyes widening as she read. "Mrs. Hayes, this is one of the most blatant cases of estate fraud I've ever seen. Your husband systematically transferred assets, your son notarized fraudulent documents, and there's clear evidence of conspiracy. If we move fast, we can freeze everything before any transfers occur." "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "I don't want to freeze anything yet. I want them to think they've won. I want to see exactly how far they'll go, and I want them to incriminate themselves completely. Can we do that?" Rebecca smiled grimly. "I like the way you think, but it's risky. What if they move assets before we can act?" "They won't. The estate is still in probate. They need me to sign documents first. Documents giving Daniel power of attorney. Documents authorizing the house sale. They think I'm too stupid and too grief-stricken to read the fine print. Let them keep thinking that." With Rebecca's guidance, Margaret began building her case methodically. Susan ordered tiny wireless cameras online, the kind that looked like smoke detectors or phone chargers. They installed them in the living room, kitchen, and Richard's old office. Every conversation with Daniel or Patricia would now be recorded. Margaret created a secret email account and uploaded every document from the storage unit to a secure cloud server. She made 3 sets of physical copies, storing them in different locations. One with Rebecca, one in Susan's safety deposit box, and one with a trusted friend from church who had no connection to the family. Then came the performance of her life. When Daniel arrived with estate documents for her to sign, papers that would have given him complete control over her finances, Margaret played her role perfectly. She picked up the papers with trembling hands, squinted at them, and said in a wavering voice, "Oh, Daniel, this is all so overwhelming. All these legal words. Can I have a few days to think about it? My mind is just so foggy since your father passed." Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Mom. Take your time. We just want to help you through this difficult transition." The camera hidden in the bookshelf captured every word, every fake expression of concern. Patricia visited 3 days later, subtly pressuring Margaret about downsizing. "Mom, this house is so big for just you. We found a lovely assisted living facility with a waiting list. If you signed up now, they'd have a room available next month. Wouldn't that be easier than maintaining this place alone?" Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I suppose you're right, dear. I just need time to adjust to the idea. Leaving the home your father and I built together." "I understand," Patricia said, patting her hand, "but Dad would want you somewhere safe and cared for." The camera recorded Patricia's lies. The hidden microphone caught every manipulative word. But Margaret's most dangerous move was yet to come. She called Jennifer Hartwell. They needed to talk. Margaret arranged to meet Jennifer at a quiet cafe in Medina, 40 miles outside Cleveland, where nobody would recognize either of them. She brought Susan along as backup, sitting at a separate table with her phone positioned to record everything. Margaret's hands were steady now. The trembling widow was gone. In her place sat a woman who needed answers. Jennifer arrived looking haunted, dark circles under her eyes, her expensive clothes hanging loose like she'd lost weight. She slid into the booth across from Margaret, clutching a folder to her chest like a shield. "Mrs. Hayes, I know you have every reason to hate me. I know what I did was unforgivable, but please, you need to hear me out. We're both in danger." Margaret's voice was ice. "You have 5 minutes. Talk." The story that poured out of Jennifer was worse than Margaret had imagined. "I met Richard 15 years ago at a conference. I was 26, working as a junior consultant. He told me he was separated from you, that the marriage had been over for years, that you had an arrangement. I believed him because I was young and stupid and wanted to believe." Jennifer's voice cracked. "He showed me fake separation papers. He said the divorce was just waiting for his children to finish college so they wouldn't be hurt by it." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Jennifer continued, tears streaming down her face. "For 15 years, I was his secret. He'd spend half his time with me in Columbus, half with you in Cleveland. I thought I was his future. I thought once his kids were settled, we'd finally be together publicly." She opened her folder with shaking hands. "But 2 months ago, everything changed. Richard got sick so fast, and Daniel and Patricia started calling me." She slid papers across the table, printouts of emails and text messages. Margaret read them, her blood pressure rising with each word. Messages from Daniel to Jennifer. "Dad's estate needs to be settled quickly. Are you prepared to play your role?" Messages from Patricia. "Once the insurance pays out, remember our agreement. You get your share, we get ours, and Mother gets managed." "They knew about you," Margaret said quietly. "My children knew their father had a mistress, and they were fine with it as long as they got paid." "It gets worse." Jennifer pulled out more documents. "I found these in Richard's email, messages between him and Michael Preston about medications, about accelerating the timeline, about making sure everything was in place before you could complicate things. Mrs. Hayes, I think they killed him. I think Richard agreed to it initially because he was dying anyway, and he wanted to control when and how. But Daniel and Patricia had their own reasons. They wanted him dead before you figured anything out." Margaret's hands clenched into fists under the table. "Do you have proof?" "Pharmacy records. Richard was prescribed medications that shouldn't have been mixed with his cancer treatments. Patricia was managing his medication schedule those last few weeks. And there's this." She slid across one final email dated 3 weeks before Richard's death. It was from Daniel to Michael Preston. "The sooner this happens, the sooner we can move forward. Mom's starting to ask questions. We need Dad's death to look natural and happen soon." Margaret stared at those words. Her son discussing her husband's death like a business transaction. Her children had murdered their own father. For money. And they'd planned to destroy their mother next. She looked up at Jennifer. "You're going to help me, and in exchange, I'll make sure you don't go to prison. But right now, you're going to do exactly what I tell you. Understood?" Jennifer nodded desperately. Margaret pulled out her phone and called Rebecca Torres. "It's time. Set up the meeting. I want everyone there. Daniel, Patricia, Michael, Jennifer, and anyone else who is close to Richard. Tell them I'm ready to sign everything. Tell them I've accepted that it's time to move on." "Are you sure?" Rebecca asked. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Margaret looked across the table at Jennifer, then over at Susan, who nodded. Encouragement from across the cafe. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. It's time these people learned that underestimating me was their biggest mistake." She scheduled the meeting for the following Monday at Rebecca's law office. She told Daniel it was a notary's office, neutral ground to finalize everything properly. She invited Richard's business associates, saying she wanted witnesses to honor Richard's memory. Everything was in place. The trap was set. In 72 hours, her betrayers would walk into that conference room thinking they'd won. They would leave in handcuffs. Margaret Hayes was ready for war. The conference room was packed when Margaret arrived, deliberately late, still playing the scattered widow one last time. Daniel and Patricia sat at the large oak table looking impatient. Michael Preston checked his watch repeatedly. Jennifer sat in the corner, her face pale and frightened. Several of Richard's business associates had shown up, confused about why they'd been invited. And Rebecca Torres stood at the head of the table, professional and composed. Under her cardigan, Margaret wore the wire detective James Morrison had fitted that morning. Every word spoken in this room was being transmitted to police headquarters downtown. Detective Morrison and 2 officers were stationed in the building's parking lot, waiting for her signal. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret said softly, setting down her purse. "I know you're all busy. I just wanted to settle Richard's affairs properly with everyone present." Daniel pulled out his thick folder of documents, barely containing his eagerness. "Mom, these are the papers we discussed. This one transfers the house into a sale trust so we can get it on the market quickly. This one gives me power of attorney to manage your finances, just temporarily, to help you through this transition. And this is your agreement to move into Meadowbrook Assisted Living. They have a lovely room available starting December 1st. Patricia added with fake sweetness, "It's really for the best, Mom. You've seemed so confused lately. We just want you safe and cared for." Margaret picked up a pen, examining the documents. Every eye in the room focused on her hand. Then she set the pen down. "I just have one question before I sign." Her voice was no longer soft. It was steel. "Daniel, Patricia, when exactly did you decide to murder your father?" The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Patricia's face drained of color. Daniel shot to his feet. "Mom, what are you talking about? This is grief talking. You're clearly not well. Sit down." The command in Margaret's voice froze him. "Is it grief that made me find the storage unit on Maple Street? Is it confusion that showed me the emails between all of you planning to overdose Richard with conflicting medications? Is it my fuzzy memory that recorded every conversation where you manipulated and lied to me?" Michael Preston started to stand. "Margaret, you're clearly unwell. Maybe we should reschedule." I said, "Sit down." Margaret pulled aside her cardigan, revealing the wire taped to her chest. "Detective Morrison of the Cleveland Police Department is listening to every word. He's very interested in several felonies that have been committed here, including conspiracy to commit estate fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and murder." Rebecca Torres stepped forward, holding up her phone. On the screen were photos of documents, emails, recordings. "I'm Rebecca Torres, Mrs. Hayes' attorney, and I think everyone here should know that we have comprehensive evidence of a conspiracy to defraud Mrs. Hayes of her estate and potentially to hasten Richard Hayes' death through medication tampering." Patricia lunged across the table, grabbing for Margaret's purse. "Those documents are private. You can't—" "I can and I did," Margaret said calmly. "Every theft, every lie, every manipulation, all recorded, all documented, all admissible in court." Daniel's face twisted with rage, and in that moment he made his fatal mistake. "You stupid old woman. Do you know how much you've cost us? How much work we put into this? Dad wanted this. He wanted us to have his money not wasted on you rotting in this house. We did what had to be done." "There it is," Rebecca said quietly, tapping her phone. "Recorded confession." The conference room door opened. Detective Morrison walked in with 2 uniformed officers. "Daniel Hayes, Patricia Hayes, Michael Preston, you're under arrest." 3 months later, Margaret sat in her rose garden watching the first snow of winter dust the branches. The house was quiet, genuinely peaceful now, not the false silence that had hidden so many lies. She wrapped her hands around a mug of hot coffee and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd won. Against all odds, she'd actually won. The legal proceedings had moved swiftly once the evidence was presented. Daniel and Patricia were both charged with conspiracy to commit estate fraud, elder abuse, and accessory to voluntary manslaughter. The prosecutor argued that while Richard had initially agreed to the medication plan, Daniel and Patricia had accelerated his death without his final consent, making it murder. Both were denied bail and awaited trial in county jail. Their lawyers had already approached Rebecca about plea deals, but Margaret wasn't interested in mercy. Michael Preston had accepted a plea bargain in exchange for his testimony against Daniel and Patricia. He'd admitted to helping Richard set up the fraudulent estate documents and to providing the conflicting medications that hastened Richard's death. In exchange for his cooperation, he'd serve 7 years instead of life. His reputation in Cleveland's business community was destroyed. His consulting firm had closed within weeks of his arrest. The Swiss bank account Richard had hidden from everyone, including his co-conspirators, had been released to Margaret after 4 months of legal wrangling. Combined with the legitimate life insurance policy that was reinstated once fraud was proven, Margaret found herself with over $3 million, more money than she'd ever dreamed of having, money that was entirely, legally hers. She'd kept the house. This was her home, filled with her memories, both good and painful. She'd earned every brick of it with 42 years of devotion and sacrifice. The rose garden she'd planted had survived the winter, and in spring she planned to expand it, a garden for her new life. Jennifer Hartwell had testified for the prosecution, providing crucial emails and text messages that proved the conspiracy. In exchange for her cooperation, she'd avoided jail time. She'd moved back to Oregon and sent Margaret a long letter, not asking for forgiveness exactly, but acknowledging the harm she'd caused and thanking Margaret for giving her a second chance. Margaret had written back, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. They'd both been deceived by the same man. That created an odd sort of connection. Susan visited twice a week, bringing her children. Margaret's relationship with her youngest daughter had deepened through the ordeal. They'd fought a battle together and won. Susan had filed for sole custody of her children's relationship with Margaret, ensuring Daniel and Patricia's kids couldn't be used as manipulation tools. Some of the grandchildren had reached out on their own, old enough to understand their parents' crimes, horrified by what had happened. Margaret welcomed them with open arms. Children shouldn't pay for their parents' sins. Margaret had also transformed her own life in ways that surprised her. She'd enrolled in online courses through community college, literature and art history, subjects she'd always loved but never had time to study. She'd joined a book club at the library. She'd started volunteering at a women's shelter, sharing her story with other victims of financial abuse, showing them it was possible to fight back and win. One afternoon, she ran into James Chen, a widower from church, at the farmer's market. They'd talked for an hour about tomatoes and weather and eventually about loss. He'd asked if she'd like to have coffee sometime. Not a date, just companionship. She'd said yes. Margaret looked at her reflection in the kitchen window and barely recognized the woman staring back. 67 years old, silver hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned up, eyes bright with purpose instead of dulled by routine. She'd spent 42 years being what everyone else needed. Now, finally, she was becoming herself. 6 months after that confrontation in the conference room, Margaret stood in her rose garden on a warm spring morning and realized something profound. The roses she'd planted 42 years ago, the ones she'd watered through droughts, protected through harsh winters, tended through countless seasons, had survived everything. Just like her. She thought about the young woman who'd left that warning note on Richard's coffin. If Jennifer hadn't found the courage to reach out, if she hadn't left that cryptic message, Margaret might have signed away everything. She might have ended up in that assisted living facility, confused and alone, wondering how her life had gone so wrong. That single act of conscience from an unlikely source had changed everything. Margaret's story isn't unique. Every year, thousands of elderly Americans are financially exploited by the very people who should protect them most, their own family members. According to the National Adult Protective Services Association, Financial abuse of the elderly costs victims over $30 billion annually. And the perpetrators? In over 60% of cases, it's a family member, a son, a daughter, someone trusted with power of attorney or access to bank accounts. The saddest part is that most victims never fight back. They're too ashamed, too afraid, too convinced that family loyalty means accepting abuse silently. They'd rather lose everything than admit their children betrayed them. Margaret almost became one of those statistics, but she made a different choice. Here's what Margaret's story teaches us. Trust is beautiful, but blind trust is dangerous. Being kind doesn't mean being naive. Being selfless doesn't mean accepting exploitation. And being a victim doesn't mean you have to stay a victim. It's never too late to stand up for yourself, no matter your age, no matter how long you've been silent, no matter how powerful your oppressors seem. Family bonds are sacred, but they don't excuse criminal behavior. Love shouldn't require you to accept betrayal, and blood relation doesn't grant anyone the right to steal from you, manipulate you, or treat you as disposable. Real family, the kind worth keeping, would never ask you to sacrifice your dignity, your security, or your future for their greed. Margaret also learned that sometimes the people we trust most are wearing masks. Richard seemed like a devoted husband for 42 years, but he was living a double life. Daniel and Patricia seemed like concerned children, but they were plotting theft and murder. The lesson isn't to trust no one, it's to verify everything. Ask questions, read documents before signing, keep your own bank accounts, maintain your independence. These aren't signs of distrust, they're signs of wisdom. If you're watching this and you see yourself in Margaret's story, if family members are pressuring you to sign papers you don't understand, if you're being rushed through financial decisions, if you're being made to feel stupid or senile when you ask questions, please get help. Contact an elder abuse hotline. Find an independent attorney who works for you, not your family. Talk to someone outside the situation. You deserve protection. You deserve respect. You deserve justice. And if you're someone who's been thinking about exploiting an elderly parent or relative, remember this. Margaret Hayes won. Smart, determined victims often do. The temporary gain isn't worth prison, public humiliation, and losing everything you value. Choose integrity over greed. Choose honesty over theft. Choose to be someone worthy of the trust placed in you. Now we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Would you have confronted your children immediately, or would you have planned your revenge quietly like Margaret did? Have you or someone you know ever experienced family betrayal or elder abuse? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else who's facing the same situation right now. If Margaret's story moved you, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. It might save them from a similar fate. And subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of ordinary people overcoming extraordinary betrayal. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Remember this, you are stronger than you think. You are smarter than they believe. And you are never, ever too old to fight back. Margaret Hayes was 67 when she decided to stop being a victim and start being a warrior. If she can do it, so can you. Justice doesn't always come easy, but it's always worth fighting for.